Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me for season 3 of Spare a Thought. If you're new to the show, welcome. Spare a Thought is the podcast where I try to shine a light on the people, ideas, issues, and organisations that are often overlooked or misrepresented in the media. I'm your host, Tom Spare. Before I introduce my guest for today, I want to talk a little bit about what's in store for season 3. Today's episode will focus on Wales and the media. Episode 2 will feature Kim Mamhende from the charity The Kai talking about supporting migrant communities. In episode 3, I interviewed Dr. Julia Grace Patterson, a former doctor turned campaigner who is the CEO of Every Doctor. In that episode, we talk about the NHS, the risk of privatisation, and the working conditions for doctors and nurses. In episode 4, Amanda Hamilton joins me from the National Association of Licensed Paralegals to discuss paralegals and legal aid, as well as the impact of COVID and the pandemic on the justice system. And after that, the podcast takes a slightly different form. For 4 episodes, I'll recount my travels across the United States in October and November of 2024. As Donald Trump and Kamala Harris battled it out for the presidency, I made my way from New York to New Orleans, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. to witness firsthand one of the most consequential elections of our time. Going spare in the USA, 4 episodes, 4 cities, 1 presidential election. And that's coming soon to your feed. So that's enough self-promotion from me. In today's episode, I speak to Will Hayward, a Wales-based journalist, formerly of Wales Online and Reach plc, now a freelancer and columnist for The Guardian. Will also entered the podcasting world recently, co-hosting For Wales, See Wales, which highlights politics and news stories coming out of Wales in a light-hearted and accessible way. Would really recommend it. They've been doing the recording recently in the Senedd itself, and there's an excellent interview with Mark Drayford in there too. Will maintains an excellent Substack, which I'm going to share in the show notes. It's really worth subscribing to. So let's get into it and spare a thought for Wales and the media with Will Hayward. When you were at school and you had a careers day, what were you saying to that careers advisor about what you wanted to do when you grow up?
It definitely wasn't being a journalist. I'm quite badly dyslexic, so I never even considered journalism as a career, ultimately. I wanted to be a paleontologist, I wanted to be a marine biologist, and then I went to did politics at Cardiff University and then became a personal trainer. Basically, I didn't really realise I wanted to be a journalist until I was about 26, 27. So there's a bit of a journey to getting there. But I think, I would say this, but I think some of the best journalists I know are people who have done other stuff, and I think they have that kind of awareness of the wider world. So absolutely. At school, it didn't even occur to me to be a journalist.
What drew you to journalism, and what sort of was there a particular moment that you thought, oh, actually, this is something for me?
So I was working for myself, doing like kind of training and like sports training. I was working with para athletes a lot, and obviously in some ways that's really like rewarding. I started writing like blogs just to promote my work, and I really quite enjoyed that. Probably it sounds a bit egotistical, but the kind of the attention you get from doing it, that you can put your thoughts into the world and people are interested in it or not interested in it, but they at least have views on it. As I started doing my training, like it wasn't the Brexit vote happened after I qualified, but the world was just getting a bit nastier, you could see things are going in a bad direction. And I think because as a journalist, you can do something that when there's powerful people, they don't really care. They're lawyered up to their eyeballs. You can't really touch them legally. They're very, very rich. You're not really going to be able to hurt them in that way. But what you can do is you can publicize their deeds, and that is actually something that's still incredibly powerful. I think that idea of being professionally mischievous was a very exciting thing for me. So I did my training at Cardiff University. I did the master's course in news journalism, got my shorthand, my legal qualifications. But then afterwards, I got offered a job as a reporter at Wales Online, and I wasn't sure about taking it. And then when I started doing it, I was like, actually, this is so much fun. Just because you get to be, there's no other job where you don't. In journalism, obviously, you have contacts, you have sources that you have to work with and cultivate, but ultimately, you are kind of an independent thing in of yourself. You are trying to be a voice of a readership, and that is such a different mentality. I think I found that really exciting.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, you can sort of go it on your own, and yeah, I suppose that's true actually, because there's lots of careers where there's different types of journalism, and maybe we'll discuss this as well. But when you're out on the road, just trying to get information, it's down to you and finding sources, and yeah, I guess that's quite you're a sort of detective in a way, in a sense.
Yeah, you are, but it's also the fact that you just don't have to. You obviously have your editor and you have your readership and you have the law, but you don't have to like. It's a industry where people say, oh, it's changing loads, and actually, I think that's really exciting. Like there's so many industries where you kind of go through the motions, whereas journalism, you can try things, you can say, oh, you can do things for the simple fact that they're quite fun and they're just fundamentally interesting. And I think there's not many areas where you can do that, and so I think that was something that really appealed to me.
What's the role of a journalist, particularly in a digital age when there's lots of question marks about truth and facts, but also, I guess, working in an attention economy, sort of where people have got lots of distractions? What's the role of a journalist now in perhaps in comparison to previous years?
Fundamentally, the role of a journalist is the same. I just think how they go about fulfilling that role is different. Ultimately, you're there to be the eyes and ears of your readership. You're there to kind of help the public understand what is happening. And there's the cliches of you're there to talk truth to power, and that's absolutely the case. But you're also you're not. I mean, there's lots of different forms of journalism, like TV journalism and stuff like that often gets looked down on. But actually, I think there's a real skill to that, and that's something people are really interested in. And it's also, this isn't a new thing. Like if you go back to newspapers going back before the internet, people act like it was this bastion of just endless public interest journalism. A lot of it was just funny stuff, or stuff that was just whimsy, or just highlighting weird things that happened, or people just buying it for a crossword. So I think the way that you go about doing it has massively changed, and it's changed. People will be like, oh, it's really, things aren't as good as they were because people used to buy these newspapers and they'd have all this great stuff in. But actually, sometimes they'd only be buying it for one or two things within it. And what's good now is you can see exactly what people are reading, where they're reading to in it, what point they stopped reading. You can put different headlines on the same story and see which does better, see what people are trying to engage with. So you can tailor your content much more to your readers than you've ever been able to do. But obviously with that comes, you've still the financial imperative on journalism has also changed. So before, the price, if we're talking about newspapers, the price of a newspaper was really negligible for the amount of profit they made. It was all about the ads. It was all about the classifieds. It was all about all that sort of stuff. Whereas now, actually, the cover price is a massive part of it. The rat race to try and monetize online journalism and make that pay, and that business of journalism is something that people are still working out, but that's actually quite exciting. So how you pay for journalism and fund it has changed. I think the fundamentals are exactly the same.
Yeah, the skills are fundamentally there, aren't they? It's just the sort of changing technology. When I was doing my MA dissertation, which still sort of gives me horrors to this day, actually, I still feel the relentlessness of it. I interviewed Professor Leighton Andrews about sort of politics, journalism, and sort of the media, and he was talking about how when Facebook and Google sort of basically absorbed all the ad funds, that local journalism was funding as well. I mean, we'll talk about that too. But yeah, the model of funding it, and I think you're right to point out that it's very easy to look at things through rose-tinted glasses about, oh, it was a simpler time before we had the internet and before these challenges. But then you also had media barons, you had, over time, you've had all these different sort of powers involved in the running of the media, for better or worse, So it's probably quite easy to say, well, it was better before. I think you're probably one of the first people I've talked to who said, but you can actually know what your readers are reading.
Yeah. I mean, newspapers were declining before the advent of the internet. So what that suggests, I think, is that they weren't fulfilling a role in people's lives as much as they were. And, I think it's easy to get snobby about how media's changed, but ultimately you can be super, super specialized now and make a living out of it. And that's quite exciting. I mean, I think the big challenge now is that everyone can pretend to be a journalist without the kind of skills, application, training that comes with that. they basically have a smartphone and they say, well, I'm a citizen journalist. I'm like, well, you're a man with a smartphone, a Facebook account. Like, journalism isn't just publish what you publish, it's what you choose not to publish. And that is a really big thing. And I think that gone on to a bit of a tangent, but I think that is a bigger issue to me than the decline in print, which was happening before the internet and is happening. So it wasn't the amount of people who will decry the decline of like local media but haven't actually bought a newspaper for 20 years. It's like, well, okay.
Yeah, fair point. So you've written 2 books, one about Wales and COVID and the other about whether Wales should leave the UK. Why were these topics in particular of interest to you? And are you English or were you born in Wales?
I'm English. So
you're English.
I moved to Wales in 2007, 2008, and I just never left.
Okay.
So why did I choose 2 topics? So the first one was called Lockdown Wales, and that was about the first wave of COVID in Wales. So I was one of the few people who were in both the UK government press lobby and the Welsh government press lobby throughout the pandemic. And that gave you that insight into how they were both approaching this really big catastrophic thing differently and how they were doing it the same. Because ultimately they were both working from the same evidence base. They're both working from the Sage papers, but yet we're coming to these quite different conclusions. I pitched it about a month into the pandemic, so April 2020, and I handed in final draft at the end of August. So it was like kind of 3 months where I put that together. And it was kind of a first draft. It was a kind of classic first draft of history thing. Like, looking back, I'm like, oh God, I could do that so much better now. But it was like important, and it was important for me at the time, and I think it was useful. The second book was, I'm still very proud of, was called Independent Nation, and it looked at Welsh independence, and it assessed, people look at Scottish independence in a much more like serious way than they ever have Welsh independence. So there's like lots of studies done. There's really very little out there about Welsh independence, but people were talking about it for the first time. It was like the rise of Yes Cymru. It was just after Brexit. It was just after COVID. And people were like thinking like, oh, could this thing like an independent Wales work? And there was a lot of misinformation out there about it from both sides. So that book is essentially a toolkit for someone forming their own opinion. So it doesn't tell anyone what to think. It says, if you are in favour of independence, these are the questions you need to answer. These are the things, if you're considering a point of view on independence, that you need to be aware of. So it looked at all sorts of stuff like what would happen with pensions, what would happen with the border, what would happen with the royal family, what currency would you have, how would it work economically, would you be a member of the EU, why the current system doesn't work. It doesn't work because the premise of the book is wherever you stand on Welsh independence, there is no doubt that what Wales currently has just doesn't work. So it was that was really interesting. That came out in late 2022, and so it's really exciting. So I had a year off writing books, and now I'm in the middle of writing another one, which every time I do it, I think, why the hell am I doing this? This is so much work. But it's all good fun.
Yeah, and are you able to share what the topic is for the next book, or is that under wraps?
No, that's fine. It's called. So the way I've written all my books has been quite public, that I'm writing this and I'm working on this and showing my workings as I go along, because I think most of my books are on stuff that other people haven't really done much on. So I find it useful. Because I wasn't an expert on Welsh independence before I wrote the book, and I wasn't an expert on COVID before. How COVID played out in Wales. I'm not an epidemiologist before I wrote the other one. So I kind of do the trying to answer questions is like my MO for book writing. So this one is called Who Cares About Wales? And everyone agrees that Wales has got a huge range of issues, and everyone can see from data, from just all the evidence, that this has been the case for 100 years, and it's not really getting better. So it kind of asks the question why. So it will look at failures from the UK government, failures from the Welsh government, but then ultimately it also looks at the fact that people in Wales we're so disengaged with this country that we live in that we have to take some responsibility as well. So I'm handing in the final draft of that in October this year. So hopefully that'll come out before the Senedd election next, like early spring.
And how do you approach the research, and where do you sort of get the inspiration for that topic? Is it more of a sort of innate of a feeling to go, oh, this is a itch I want to scratch, or is it sort of wider than that?
I'll take the second question first. So the way I decide what I want to do a book on is, well, the first thing is is there a market for it? Because ultimately, there'll be lots of authors who are, it is a creative process. For me, I'd never describe myself as a creative. It's I want to find an answer to a question. So it's ultimately, I'm trying to find something that's really important and topical, and I don't think it's got enough attention. So I think every journalist wants to be relevant and feel like what they're writing is relevant. So I try and pick the most relevant topic. So at the time, during COVID, it was obviously COVID. Welsh independence was a topic which a lot of people were talking about, but not from an informed perspective. And then with this one, everyone can see that, we've had a change in government in Westminster and Wales is still struggling. So in terms of how I go about the process, it depends on the book. So the first one, because I was writing about COVID all day, every day in my job anyway, it was actually pretty easy because I was just collating my notes at the end of the day and putting it in like order. Whereas with the Welsh independence book, because I thought what I'd do at the start was take the yes side and the no side and compare their two arguments. But the problem is that the pro-independence side just wasn't very developed. It just hadn't got a lot of like research underpinning it. And there wasn't really a pro-union side because you either supported Welsh independence or you just didn't really give a crap about it. So there wasn't really two sides to compare. So a lot of the time I was doing my own, I was working out like what questions to ask. So first kind of 3 or 4 months, I just speaking to as many people as I can, like giving them a damn good listening to and trying to work out what the best questions were to ask. And then the way I do it, I create a Google Doc for every chapter I think there's going to be. And I find out as much stuff as I can. I throw things in a Google Doc. It all goes in the separate Google Docs. And then after a few months, I read through all the Google Docs and go, right, what other questions do I feel like I need to answer? And then I try and answer them and I throw all that in the Google Doc. And then I build each chapter from that Google Doc. But yeah, and it's similar with this one, the upcoming one. I'm currently coming to the end of my big listening phase. And so it's fun. It's enjoyable.
With your MA, did that help? Has that helped with the book writing stuff? Do you think you would have been able to write a book before doing your MA, or is it very much shaped by your experience of doing the MA, then the experiences you've had as a journalist that's then informs the writing?
I think the thing that the MA did was it trains you to write quick. Like the issue with the books is never the time writing. Like once I know what I'm going to write, it doesn't take really any time at all. So for the last book, I did about 8-9 months of research, and then I took a month off work and wrote the book in a month. Like it wasn't the actual act of writing it wasn't hard. So yeah, the MA trained me, was good in terms of the ability to write a lot in a short space of time. But I think probably the biggest thing is just like drilling into like those basic tenets of like journalism and journalistic integrity and journalistic process, and making those things innate and you just understanding them. Like making those things automatic was probably the biggest asset from doing that course.
When I was conducting my MA research, I found a stat that's about 20 years old. So this information's a bit out of date, but it's a bit different now. That suggested 85% of all news consumed in Wales was produced in England. Could you sort of give us an overview of what the media environment is like in Wales, and what are the news sources that people go to in Wales generally?
I'm always pretty skeptical about those sort of surveys because ultimately, like sometimes they'll say like Reach PLC is an English place, but actually Wales Online is the most read Welsh news source. Almost 2 million people read it a day, and it is owned by Reach, which is a FTSE company. But I was in that newsroom for 8 years. The top people there are actually first language Welsh speakers. We all live in Wales, so I'm always a bit skeptical about it. In terms of the media landscape in Wales, obviously you've got BBC Wales, which is like Welsh focused. You've got ITV Wales, you've got Channel 4 who do a little bit on Wales. You've got Wales Online, which is like the behemoth, like it gets a lot of criticism, but is also the only site that has ever managed to really mass market Welsh news and get and also people will say, oh, we've done stuff which isn't about Wales. I'm like, yeah, the BBC do stuff that isn't about England or the Britain, don't they? Like it's stuff that's of interest to people in Wales, not exclusively about Wales. If there is a mass shooting in Manchester, people in Flintshire aren't going, I don't really care about that. It's in Manchester. But if you've done it in Wrexham, then I'm interested. Like it isn't just how it works. So got Wales Online, you've got smaller publications like Nation Cymru, and then you've got Welsh language publications, and then there's some regional titles all over Wales, some hyperlocals, there's sort of things like the Caerphilly Observer. But there's not a huge media landscape with regard to political coverage. And what I'd say is there's not a diverse range of political coverage, which is what I left Wales Online and I became a columnist, a Welsh columnist to The Guardian. But my main income is through my newsletter, and that newsletter is positioned as kind of high-end political analysis on Wales and Welsh issues done accessibly. And the reason I feel like I could do that and it's gone well is because it's I think there's a market for it, because ultimately most people forget most journalism is a business. So, people do often forget that news organizations have to make money unless you're kind of owned by an oligarch, in which case you're just a mouthpiece for someone else's political view.
What are the challenges of being a journalist in Wales, do you think?
Specifically in Wales? I suppose the biggest thing is like what we spoke about earlier, like that lack of engagement between people in Wales with Welsh politics. I mean, there's interest in Welsh sport, for instance, like rugby and things like that. There's big engagement, but the lack of understanding of Welsh issues and essentially the realities of the Welsh political system. So I think COVID massively helped that in terms of people being aware of the Welsh government and what they're responsible for and things like that. So I think that's the challenge is, if you write a story about Westminster for a wider British audience, people will probably know who the Prime Minister is, and they'll probably know who the Chancellor is. Like, even if they're pretty politically engaged, there's a pretty good chance they'll know who the Prime Minister is. That isn't the case in Wales. So you're always reporting from a lower level of base knowledge. So that is something that you always kind of have to be aware of. If you want your journalism to be accessible, is you can't just assume that people know things which to you are fairly basic. I think that's quite a big challenge. I think the other tricky thing is so I'm based in Cardiff, and I think doing Pan Wales news can be hard, because coverage of North Wales, I think, is pretty. I think there's some really good titles in North Wales and journalists that make a real effort to make sure North Wales issues are highlighted. But I don't think overall many, and I'm absolutely at fault for this. I mean, I went to North Wales last week just to try and get a flavour for what was happening there. Like, I went to Wrexham, Bangor, and Esmond, but I think that is probably one of the tricky things, is that the centre of gravities for different parts of Wales are different. So the gravity of North Wales is towards Merseyside, especially in the east of the northeast of Wales. So I think that is another challenge of covering Wales.
And yeah, the geography is challenging as well, isn't it? And, you get into places, transport's always a big question mark, and in Wales. But,
yeah.
So the Senedd Elections are taking place next year. You've sort of alluded to that already. You've interviewed the leaders of the major parties and most of the leaders in Wales. What's your reading of these leaders and their chances of being First Minister in 2026?
I think realistically, there's only three people who have a chance of being First Minister. It's either Eluned Morgan from Labour, it's Rhun ap Iorwerth from Plaid Cymru, or it is whoever Reform decide to make their Welsh leader, which they still haven't bothered to do. That's realistically the only people I can see can do that. I don't really see how any of the other parties can do it. So it's one of those three who are going to be the next First Minister.
Who's the likeliest of all those three, do you think?
I think the Reform one is the least likely of the three, just because the only people that Reform can really ally with in the Senedd are the Tories. I think who is the most likely? At this point, you've got to say Rhun from Plaid, but it is very, very close. Yeah, as things currently stand, I think it's Rhun. I think it will become more likely to be Eluned as we get nearer to the election. If UK Labour can throw Wales any bones at all, but I just don't know if they will. So it's it's tough. It's tough to know.
And what's your reading as well? Because obviously the Senedd is expanding. From the conversations that you have, as when you're sort of from your experience of reporting, of looking at Welsh politics, you've talked about that there's a general lack of understanding of politics in Wales and how it runs. What's the views, do you think, of the feeling more broadly about that expansion of the Senedd and people's understanding of it?
In terms of people's understanding of the Senedd, I think it's very, 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 very low. I think the average member of the public doesn't really know how it works. I think some people do. I think most people don't. I think with regard to the changes, I think that is going to be very confusing to people, because I think sometimes I listen to some of the parties and I feel like they don't know. It's gonna be really tough for Labour, the new system. They've kind of made a system which kind of screws them, which is bizarre. A bizarre position to put yourself in. They have. So yeah, I think it's going to be confusing, because people who do vote in Senedd elections, which is less than 50% of eligible voters, they're used to the previous system where you vote for a regional and a constituency MS, whereas now you are going to be voting for just one on a list, and you'll get 6 members representing your area. So it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how that falls. But I mean, it's a proportional system now. If we get 40% Labour votes, we should get 40% roughly of VMSs. So it's going to be reflective of people who decide to vote in Wales, at least.
And after leaving Wales Online, you went freelance. So you're a columnist for The Guardian, you publish on Substack, and you co-host a podcast. Could you talk about each of these experiences and then what you enjoy most about them and what the challenges are of being a freelancer?
Taking each in turn. So The Guardian's really fun. I mean, the interesting thing with The Guardian is you're not necessarily just writing for a Welsh audience, which is different for me. You're writing for people who would be, could be reading that in America or Australia. So you've got to be, you're zooming out a lot in terms of your analysis, but sometimes you're using a very, very zoomed in hook to do that wider analysis. So that has been interesting. That's been fun. I think it's important that people in other parts of the UK are aware of Wales and Welsh issues. The newsletter has been good. So my main source of income is the newsletter. Like, I've got sponsors on it now, which is really, really helpful. So it's not just paying subscribers, it's also sponsors paying to be associated with it, which is just so helpful. Then there's the podcast. So the podcast I do with a company called Heyman Media based in Newport, and I do it with 2 comedians who I know called Mel Owen and Robin Morgan, and it's brilliant fun. So the idea is the newsletter is kind of a bit more in-depth analysis, whereas the podcast is like accessible Welsh politics. So it's designed for people who are not otherwise engaged in Welsh politics to understand what is happening around them and highlight issues that Wales has.
And as the podcast brought up any surprises for you? For example, because I've sort of listened to lots of the episodes, and I really enjoyed the Mark Drakeford one because I thought that was a lot of fun. And he sort of, it's interesting to see a different side of a politician and they're a bit more relaxed.
We had a cheese board, didn't we, and stuff like that. While we chatted to him.
Yeah. Nothing like a cheese board to keep morale high. But so has there anything surprised you about doing the podcast?
I'm surprised how interested people have been, to be honest. We did a live show last week at the Cardiff Glee Club, which had 250 people at, which was like, blimey, I can't believe 250 people willing to put their hand in their pocket on a sunny weekend to come and watch us talk about Welsh politics. I think, the thing that surprised me is how engaged people have been and how interested people have been and how it's a lot of work. But as you'll know, as someone who does podcasts yourself, like it's a lot of work. What helps us is that we do it for a company who are experts and are good at it. So that the Heyman guys are really, really helpful in that regard. In terms of surprising how much fun it is, like it's really actually quite fun just chatting about Welsh politics because so few people do it. So you feel like actually you can make a meaningful difference. Like if that Mark Drakeford's podcast that you mentioned got headlines, or like some of the lines we got from it, we've got headlines all over the UK, and that was really cool. Like it's cool to feel like you're driving the agenda in the country in which you live. I think the thing I'd just say is like journalism's still a really, really good career. I actually think now is the best time ever to go into journalism because I know people are quite down on the industry sometimes, but actually if you are a young, dynamic person who wants to, tell stories that matter, you can rise up quicker than you ever could. Like, if I was in journalism 30 years ago, I'd still be a general reporter. My copy wouldn't have been that good, clean. So people would have been like, oh, I'm not really sure about him. I'd have been like, whereas now, because of how newsrooms are changing every day, if you can make your skills super relevant really quickly. So I think it's a really exciting time to go into journalism. And also, look, like the world is in many ways going to hell. Like you need people who care to write about and talk about things that are happening. So I think it's a really exciting time to go into journalism. I just wouldn't want to put anyone off ever doing that.
What sort of routes would you recommend? Is it more of a case of trying to build because obviously, I guess you are too a millennial, right? So, our approach to things is probably a bit different to the generation that's coming up now, Generation Z, who are digital natives, who consume news and information in a different way. What sort of the route do you think people, if they wanted to be a journalist or go into that field, should think about?
I think getting experience, I think the hardest thing about journalism is like going freelance straight away is hard because not only are you like, you don't have contacts, you also just don't have experience. Like I learned so much from seeing other journalists and like just listening to them on the phone, watching how they went about their business, chatting to them, like finding out how they tick. That was really helpful for me. So I think if you can get yourself on placements, there's some good placements. The course I did at Cardiff, the Masters, was really, really good. Like it really trained me up for it really well. So I'd highly recommend something like that. There are grants and stuff that you can get for it. There's scholarships out there as well if money's an object. So obviously if you're in if you want a job to make lots of money, it's probably not the right career. Like but I think one of the biggest things you can do in journalism in terms of safeguarding yourself long term is to build an independent profile for yourself. So if you are going to a news organization, look, I'm bringing 8,000 people, 8,000 social media followers with me, that's a massive thing because everyone is desperately trying to reach people, especially young people. So if you can bring that with you, then that's a real asset. So building your own personal profile, but credibly, like, that is something I'd advise.
And that concludes this episode of Wales and the Media. A big diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much to our excellent guest, Will Hayward. To ensure you are notified of when the next episode is released, make sure you subscribe to Spare a Thought. It'd be great if you could rate and share the show with friends, family and colleagues. The title track for this show is Young Shall Grow. Credit and thanks to Afro Cluster, Magugu and Asha Jane. The show was researched, written and edited by me, Tom Spare. This has been a Be The Change Media Network production. Thanks for listening.
Life you don't give up, even when you know if you fall, get back up. Young shall grow, whether you like them or not. Young shall grow.